So what I'm going to talk about is the use of virtual reality to teach ethics, to teach moral philosophy. And I'm not really interested in how professionals make decisions. I'm interested in the philosophical concepts behind the way we make decisions. And I started thinking about this because I started here in the university full-time 2 years ago now to teach, to found the new philosophy degree here in the university. And as part of that, I teach ethics, moral philosophy. And when I was beginning to think about how I was going to teach this, I was reading around the subject a bit, and I discovered that there's a good deal of evidence that says teaching ethics has very little impact on people's actual ethical, moral decision making. And one of the pieces of evidence that the researchers cited for that was that you basically can't trust professors of moral philosophy. Teachers of moral philosophy. And I reckon that's because we can actually justify any decision that we'd like to make. But basically you can't trust us. You can't trust me, I'm telling you. And I spoke to my students, and it was fairly obvious that whatever we taught them in ethics, it was having very little impact on how they thought about their own moral decision making. And I began to wonder about that, and I thought that perhaps it's because what we do is we teach morality, we teach ethics as a rational system. We teach it as a rational decision-making process. But actually it's more complicated than that. It's more complex than that. It involves reason, it involves intuition and emotion. And how these things interact are not well understood at all. So I think there's a problem about how we teach ethics and moral philosophy. But I actually think there's also something broader going on, that this is a specific example, a specific problem, illustrating a wider problem, which is a problem to do with what we do when we teach humanities. I spend a good deal of my time in the university at open days telling people that it's a really good idea to come and do a philosophy degree and a humanities degree because you'll get transferable skills. But there's a lot of evidence that suggests that we don't actually inculcate transferable skills into humanities graduates. And I began to wonder if that's something to do with the way we teach. If what we're actually encouraging is surface learning, and we're not actually engaging them critically with who they are as thinking people. So this project, that whole idea is there in the background of this project. I came up with 3 research questions I wanted to answer. Can we use virtual reality in the classroom to stimulate moral dilemmas? Can we do that effectively and in a realistic way? Do students respond differently to the same dilemma when it's presented as a virtual reality game compared to how it's described, it's presented to them as a thought experiment? So we just ask them to think about what they might do in a hypothetical situation, as opposed to sticking them in a virtual environment and actually asking them to do something. Do they behave in the same way or a different way? And then the third question, the educational, the pedagogical element, is does the use of virtual reality change the nature of the seminar discussion about moral decision making? For me, that's the real measure. There's no point playing around with nice tech and nice virtual environments if it doesn't have an educational impact. If it doesn't change what we do in the seminar room, there's very little point in doing it, although it's a nice, attractive recruitment tool on open days when I say we're the only institution that teaches moral philosophy using virtual reality. It's a nice buzz I get back in the room. So there were 3 of us involved in the project. There's me, Chris Headland, who's senior lecturer in computer games in the School of Computer Science, and Tom Smith was one of Chris's students, Masters by Research students, and it was Tom who was part of his research. That's clever. It was Tom as part of his research that put the VR simulation together for us, and he used it as part of his own research for something else as well. So we used a problem called the trolley problem, which is hence the reference to a good place. The trolley problem was first brought into the world by a British philosopher, Philippa Foot, in 1967. And it sets up a dilemma. It's a runaway tram car or train car on some tracks, which is going to career into 5 people who are, for reasons unknown, trapped on the track, unless you, as the individual, intervene and pull a switch, in which case you will divert the trolley from the 5 people. Unfortunately, it will run over 1 person. So that was Philippa Foot's original dilemma and thought experiment. And then an American philosopher, Judith Thomson, took it on a stage further and said, okay, well, we're not pulling a lever this time. You're this time on a bridge, and the only thing you can do to stop the train crashing into the 5 people is to push an impossibly large man off the bridge, which will stop the train and therefore save the 5 people. So we had 2 iterations of the same problem, and what the 2 together do is they bring into they bring to the fore 2 forms of moral thinking, two normative moral theories: utilitarianism and deontology, or Kantian philosophy. So utilitarianism just says that we make moral decisions by making a simple calculus: which decision will bring about the greatest possible well-being or happiness as a result of the action. And so it seems obvious that what you're going to do in both cases, if you're a utilitarian, is pull the switch to kill the one, and you're going to push the impossibly large man off the bridge, because the outcome is the same. And deontology, Kantian system, is slightly more complicated. Ideas of duty. It also has a moral principle that we can't use people as means. We can only use them as an ends in ourselves. So Kantianism would forbid the second scenario, the bridge scenario, because you're using the impossibly large gentleman as an instrument to stop the train, and that's forbidden in Kantian ethics. So it sets up this tension and this dilemma. It also, overlaid on that, are 2 modes of deciding what to do in the philosophical dilemma, an ethical dilemma. Are we making our decisions based on reason, or are we making them based on emotion? Emotion's not quite the right word. It's about feelings and desires, and what we'd like the world to be like as a consequence of our actions and our beliefs. So emotion is the word that philosophers tend to use to describe this, but it doesn't quite capture what we mean by it. So that's the basic problem, and that's the tensions that it sets up. It brings into the conflict these 2 normative moral systems, moral theories, and these 2 ways of making a moral decision. And I can get students to talk about that, and they tell me all sorts of things, the merits of deontology and the merits of utilitarianism, but I'm still suspicious that I'm not actually impacting on them. They're giving me the answers that they think I want them to give, I think. So this is our system. This is it's a short video. It should just launch. Yeah, there we go. Which shows you what our system looks like. To practice without any people on the track, and then it changes, and now we've got a person on the track on one side and 5 on the other. Tom's having...
Oh boy!
Oh!
So this is the bridge. This is just the tutorial when they get to practice pushing a barrel off the track first of all. It's quite tricky to get the hang of operating it. So.
On board!
So the noise stops, and that means the train's stopped. So that's how the kind of system works. It was difficult to get a balance between, I wanted it to be immersive and I wanted it to be realistic, but I didn't want it to be so realistic that everybody thought they were really going to kind of, push real people off the bridge. Somebody suggested we don't do it by virtual reality, we do it by augmented reality, and we do it over on the railway tracks, dividing. I thought that was a bit too realistic. I thought this was immersive enough. And it's interesting watching the students' reaction. 3 students, the first time I ran it, apologized to the person they were about to have run over. And I asked them why, and they said, they look like a friend of mine. So somehow in this world, they're quite real. And the first time I tried it out, the guys in computer gaming, we bought a mannequin as part of the process. We were going to have, so there was some physical feedback as well as just the kind of what you could see. And while I was trying it out, unbeknownst to me, they put the mannequin in where my hands were going to push. And I actually felt something physical and pushed, and that was quite a shock. So we decided not to do that in the end. So the students get to run through the scenario. The actual scenario itself will do other things. We've added different things in. So you can choose to save penguins or over people and all sorts of things. So it takes it to a different dimension. But I don't really want to talk about that today. This is what happened when we ran it through with a cohort of first-year students. Before I did this, I asked them a series of questions just to establish their base ground of kind of moral attitudes and moral principles. So the 2 most relevant questions that I asked them were: is morality an action is the morality of an action determined by whether it maximizes happiness or not? So basically, it's asking them, are you basically a utilitarian? And the other relevant question is it always wrong to cause another person's death if this outcome can be avoided? I don't know if you find those results surprising, but 68% of them said no, that the morality of an action is not determined by whether it maximizes happiness or not. In other words, only 32% of the students in this first-year moral philosophy cohort are what we might think of as classic utilitarians. And 75% of them thought that it's always wrong to cause someone's death by an action of yours if you can avoid that outcome. So that would lead me to expect something like this from our cohort, that I'd expect 32% of the participants will push somebody off a bridge, because that's the test of a utilitarian in this system, if you like. The calculation is just the same. It's 1 person against 5, and the only thing is it's the 5 outweigh the 1. So I'm expecting 32 people to push the person off the bridge. We don't have an impossibly large fat man in our scenario. It cycles through a whole series of different kinds of characters, and they're male and female. They're kind of sun worshippers. They're quite hip and teenagery, and there's authority figures in there as well. And I don't think it makes much difference who the figure represents or what they look like. They just will push the person off if they're going to push them off, it seems to me. I'd also expect 75% of participants to just do nothing, to just sit back and watch events unfold. Because whatever they do, their action is going to cause someone's death, a virtual person's death. So that's what you might expect from those two questions. What you actually get is something very different. You find in the switch scenario, 82% of participants will actually pull the switch, and they'll choose to divert the train away from the 5 to the 1. So 81.5% and 18.5% choose to do nothing. So that's a difference straight away from action and stated moral principles. And pushing off the bridge, well, they're pretty similar, I think. They're slightly up. We said 32%, I think, wouldn't, and it's 37% who actually push off the bridge, and 63% don't. So straight away, we've got some differences, some tensions between what people do and what they believe their moral principles are. Straight away. That to put in a real-time situation, they begin to make decisions that aren't consistent with their moral principles. What about the question about just doing that as a thought experiment? Do we get different results in the virtual world and just doing it as a classroom thought experiment? I think the answer to that question is no. The numbers at the bottom, the self-report, are stolen from MIT because they're using the trolley problem as a global kind of research project into the use of artificial intelligence and programming self-drive cars, autonomous vehicles. And they're using it to gather ethical data about what people want cars to make, what kind of decisions they want cars to make. Something goes wrong with the car, or there's something in front of you, there's going to be an accident. Do you want the car to choose to kill the old woman or the pregnant woman? That kind of stuff. It asks those kinds of questions. So I've taken some of their data, which is basically thousands and thousands of people, as opposed to our 33 students. So they've got a much bigger, more stable database, I think, and less subject to variation. But they say 85% of people, in effect, pull the switch and choose to save the majority over the one, and 15. And I suspect, with our small cohort, that's well within our results are well within statistical limits for that. So I suspect that we're saying the same thing. Self-report in virtual reality, people behave the same way. Push the person off the bridge, it's 39, and we got 37, 61, 63. Again, I think that's within statistical limits. I think that people behave the same way in the virtual world as they do reporting it to us. So I was slightly disappointed by that. I was hoping for a big difference. But it does show us that the simulation is representing something that's going on. Then I asked the students in the seminars afterwards how they made their decision. And this is something you can't access using the thought experiment. 53% of them said they used reason and calculation, and 47% said they just felt they did what was right at the time. They acted on instinct, on intuition, on feelings. How does that translate into what we actually did in the seminar? All the students had 10 minutes in the virtual environment on their own with just me present and talking through it. So they did that on their own, so they couldn't see what everybody else was doing. And I asked them not to talk to each other about it until the end of the day when all the sessions had been finished, so that they couldn't compare notes. And I was hoping to eliminate false positives, people pushing people off the bridge for fun, because they knew nobody was going to get harmed. And I kind of built it up, saying I didn't talk about, I talked about people being killed and that kind of stuff, and sometimes virtual persons. But I made it as real as possible. And so I ran the seminar with a cohort where I've just done it as a thought experiment, and we talked, and then I let the participants more or less guide what topics we talk about in the seminar. So it's a student-led seminar, if you like. It's as close to educational practice as we can get. And the first three themes emerged in the seminar discussion. We talked about deontology versus utilitarianism. You'd expect that, I guess, in moral philosophy seminars. We talked about the relative importance of using people as, whether you could use people as means or an end, and what that meant. And we talked about the doctrine of double effect. And for those of you that aren't sure what that is, a double effect is if an action of yours has an unintended consequence, even though you know that consequence will happen as a result of your action, you're not held responsible for it. So the classic would be a palliative care doctor giving morphine to a patient to relieve their pain, but does it has to give the morphine in such a high dose that it suppresses their respiratory system and they eventually suffocate. Even though the doctor knows that the patient's going to suffocate as a result of the morphine dose, they're not responsible for killing the patient. It's double effect. Okay. Seminars after virtual reality, we get the same three topics emerging, but we also get, in addition, a long, complicated discussion about the role of emotions in ethics. We get into quite a high-level conversation about the nature of morality itself. Because everybody's begun to realise that they're not always consistent with their moral principles, which maybe they weren't aware of before, they start to talk about the role and status of moral principles, and we start to talk about moral intuition as a faculty that we may or may not have, that some philosophers think we have. So I think that's good evidence that using virtual reality changes the nature of the education experience, thinking about moral philosophy. I asked the students what they do. If I run this experiment again, what they do. 4 of them, in effect, said they do something different. I asked them what it was that they do different, and they said they'd moved from doing nothing to pulling the switch. And in one case, someone said they not only do nothing, they not only pull the switch, they'd also push the person off the bridge. So I was quite alarmed by that. I seem to be, my virtual world seems to be a factory for producing utilitarians, which, as a non-utilitarian myself, I find slightly worrying. So, to sum up, those are my 3 questions. Can VR be used in the classroom? Yes. There's a typo that in my enthusiasm I typed the wrong word. Do students respond differently to the same dilemma presented as a VR game or as described as a thought experiment? The answer is no. I've got too trigger happy with the word yes there, too enthusiastic. No, they don't. They behave in the same way. Does the virtual reality, does the use of VR change the nature of the seminar discussion? Yes, it does, resoundingly. So I think it's proof of concept at the very least.
Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you all for coming, and thank you much.